The candle on Lord Montgomery Vance's desk had burned down to a stub, and still he could not remember her face. He remembered the sound of it, a woman's voice, low and quick, speaking words he could no longer hold on to, like water slipping through cupped hands. He remembered the smell of gunpowder in a Vienna alley, the crack of a pistol, and the warm rush of blood down the side of his skull before the world went black. That was 6 weeks ago. The physicians in London had shaken their heads and murmured about the fragile nature of memory after such a blow, and sent him home to Blackwood Manor to rest. Rest did not suit him. Monty, for that was what his few close friends called him, though nobody at Blackwood dared use it, sat in his library each night with his father's old ledgers and correspondence spread before him, hunting for some thread that might pull the fog apart. Tonight, it was his signet ring that occupied him. The gold band, engraved with the Blackwood falcon, had been badly cracked during the ambush. The delicate scrollwork along its edge snapped clean through. He turned it over in the candlelight, frowning, when a soft knock disturbed his thoughts. "Enter," he said, not looking up. The scullery maid slipped in with the coal scuttle, her wool gown grey with soot, her cap pulled low over dark hair that had escaped its pins in wisps around her face. She was new to him, or perhaps not new at all, only unnoticed, the way servants often were in a house the size of Blackwood. Mr. Higgins, the butler, had mentioned her only once, in passing. The quiet one, does her work, gives no trouble. Monty had not thought of her since. She knelt by the hearth to tend the fire, careful and silent as a shadow, and it was only when she rose to leave that her eyes fell on the broken ring lying on his blotting paper. She stopped. Monty noticed the stop. In his line of work, a duke who had spent a decade as an envoy to half the courts of Europe, a person's stillness told him more than their words ever could. He watched her carefully. "You may go," he said, expecting her to bob a curtsy and vanish, as she always did. Instead, she hesitated, glanced at the door, then back at the ring. Her hand moved toward her apron pocket, drew out a small folded cloth, and unwrapped it to reveal a spool of fine silver wire and a slender jeweler's tool no bigger than a hairpin. Monty's brow furrowed. "What is this?" She said nothing. She never said anything, he realized now, turning the fact over in his mind for the first time, but she held out her hand toward the ring, palm open, a silent request. He should have refused. A scullery maid had no business handling a ducal signet worth more than she likely earned in 3 years, and yet something in the steadiness of her gaze, something almost imperious beneath the soot and the modest wool, made him place the ring in her palm without a word. She sat on the small stool by the hearth, bent her head to the task, and began to work. Monty had seen jewelers mend rings before, clumsy solder, rough files, the kind of repair a village smith might manage. What she did was nothing like that. Her fingers moved with a precision that belonged to the workshops of Paris or Vienna, weaving the silver wire through the cracked gold in a pattern he recognized at once, because he had seen it before, on the hilt of a ceremonial sword gifted to him at a royal summit years past. It was a technique known to perhaps a dozen master artisans in all of Europe, a technique reserved for the courts, not the sculleries. His breath caught. And then it happened. A flash, sudden and sharp as the pistol crack in that Vienna alley. A room hung with silk and candlelight. A woman's hands, quick and clever, mending a torn diplomatic seal at a long table crowded with ministers. A voice, her voice, saying something urgent to him in French, something about a treaty, something about danger. He could not catch the words. The image tore away as fast as it came, leaving him gripping the edge of his desk, his heart hammering. "Who taught you that?" he demanded, more sharply than he meant to. The maid froze mid-stitch. For one unguarded moment, her eyes lifted to his, and in them, Monty saw something that did not belong to a scullery maid at all. Intelligence, wariness, and beneath it, a grief so old and so deep it startled him more than the memory had. Then the shutters came down. She lowered her gaze, finished the last delicate loop of wire, and set the mended ring gently on the blotting paper before gathering her tools and slipping out of the room without a sound, without so much as a curtsy. Monty sat alone with the fire crackling low, turning the repaired signet in his fingers. The crack was gone, invisible now, the silver wire so finely woven into the gold that only close inspection would reveal it had ever been broken at all. He did not know her name, but something in him, some buried, aching certainty, told him he had met her before, and that whatever had happened between them mattered a great deal more than a duke forgetting a servant's face. He resolved, before the candle guttered out entirely, that he would learn who she truly was. 2 days had passed, and Monty had not seen the scullery maid again. He had asked Higgins her name once, over breakfast, in a tone he hoped sounded idle. "Genevieve, your grace," the butler had replied, not lifting his eyes from the silver he was arranging. "A hard worker, keeps to herself." Genevieve. The name settled into Monty's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he could not explain. He turned it over in his mind through the morning, through his ride across the eastern fields, through the long hour he spent staring blankly at correspondence he could not bring himself to answer. By the third afternoon, Blackwood Manor had visitors, Lady Caroline Pembroke and her mother, come to pay their respects to the recovering Duke, bringing with them the particular brand of gossip that travelled fastest among the gentry of Yorkshire. They were shown into the drawing-room, a grand space of pale blue silk walls and gilt-edged mirrors, where the household's best silver had been laid out for tea. Genevieve was among the maids called to serve that afternoon. She stood near the sideboard in her plain grey gown and linen cap, polishing a silver teapot with slow, careful strokes, her head bowed the way a servant's head was always meant to be bowed, present in the room, and yet somehow not present at all, the way furniture was present. Monty sat near the window, still weak enough that Dr. Fenwick had insisted he take his tea seated rather than standing to greet his guests. He watched the ladies settle themselves, watched Lady Caroline's mother lean toward her daughter with the particular gleam in her eye that meant scandal was about to be shared. "Have you heard?" the older woman said, lowering her voice only slightly, the way people do when they wish to be overheard just enough. "About the Ashworth girl?" Lady Caroline's eyes widened with practiced delight. "Lady Genevieve? I thought she'd vanished entirely from society." "Vanished, or fled, depending on who you ask. They say she was caught passing secrets to the French during the Vienna negotiations. Her own uncle testified against her before the Crown. Stripped of everything, the title, the lands, the lot. Disappeared without a trace afterward. Some say she drowned herself in shame. Others say she's hiding somewhere, too disgraced to show her face." By the sideboard, the polishing cloth in Genevieve's hand had gone still. Monty set down his cup. Something in him bristled, sharp and immediate, though he could not have said why a name he barely remembered should stir him so. "That cannot be right," he said. Both ladies turned to him in surprise. It was not usual for a duke to interrupt drawing-room gossip, particularly one still recovering from injury and rarely given to strong opinion on society matters. "Your Grace?" Lady Caroline's mother asked, blinking. Lady Genevieve Ashworth was no traitor. The words came from somewhere he could not name, rising up through the fog in his skull like a bell tolling beneath deep water. "I knew her. I worked alongside her at the Royal Summit. She was one of the sharpest minds in that hall and utterly loyal to the Crown. Whatever charge was laid against her, I would wager my own title that it was false." The room fell silent. Even Lady Caroline's mother, who prided herself on never being at a loss for words, seemed unsure how to answer a duke who spoke with such unexpected conviction on a matter of years-old scandal. "How extraordinary that you should recall her so clearly," the older woman said carefully, "when I am told your Grace has been struggling with his memory since the accident." Monty said nothing more. He had surprised even himself. The certainty in his own voice unsettled him more than the lady's gossip had, as if some part of his mind, still locked away behind the fog, knew Lady Genevieve Ashworth far better than the rest of him could recall. By the sideboard, Genevieve had turned slightly away, her shoulders drawn tight beneath her grey gown. Monty could not see her face from where he sat, but he noticed the way her hand trembled as she set the teapot down, the silver rattling faintly against the tray. A single moment, and then it was still again. The conversation moved on, as drawing-room conversations always did, drifting toward the weather and an upcoming assembly in York. But Monty found he could not follow it. His attention kept drifting to the maid by the sideboard, to the stiffness in her spine, the careful way she kept her chin low. When at last the guests rose to leave and the room emptied of chatter, Monty remained by the window a moment longer than necessary, watching Genevieve gather the tea things onto a tray. Her eyes were bright, too bright, the particular shine of tears held back through sheer will. She blinked hard, twice, and for one instant her composure nearly broke. Her lips parted, as though words long buried might finally claw their way free. "Genevieve," Monty said quietly, testing the name aloud for the first time. She froze at the sound of it, tray balanced in her hands, and looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had not dared to before. There was something raw in her expression, something that looked almost like recognition, almost like hope. The drawing-room door opened. "Your Grace." Mr. Higgins stood in the doorway, his tone smooth as ever, though his eyes flicked briefly, sharply toward Genevieve. "The lady's carriage is delayed by the eastern gate. Shall I send word to the stables?" The moment shattered. Genevieve dropped her gaze at once, dipped the barest curtsy, and hurried from the room with the tea tray, disappearing through the servant's door before Monty could say another word. Monty watched her go, the ache in his chest sharpening into something close to certainty. Whoever this quiet, watchful maid truly was, he no longer believed she was merely a scullery girl who happened to know a rare and delicate craft. He looked to Higgins, still standing in the doorway with that same unreadable smoothness, and felt, for the first time since his return from Vienna, the faint prickle of suspicion settle over his own household. Dawn had barely touched the eastern fields when Genevieve slipped out of the servants' quarters, a shawl thrown hastily over her nightdress, her feet bare against the cold stone of the corridor. Sleep had abandoned her hours ago. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Duke's face across the drawing room, heard her own name spoken aloud in that voice she had once known so well, the voice that used to call her Vive in the quiet hours after long council sessions, back when the world still made sense. She had nearly spoken. Standing there with the tea tray trembling in her hands, she had nearly broken 3 years of silence and let the truth spill out before Higgins walked through that door. The thought frightened her more than anything else had in a long while, not because the words wanted to come, but because some part of her, some small and foolish part, still believed that speaking them might undo everything. She could not risk it. Not until she understood why Higgins watched her the way he did. The stables were quiet at this hour, the grooms not yet stirring, only the soft shuffle of horses in their stalls and the low creak of the wind through the rafters. Genevieve had taken to slipping down here most mornings before her duties began, drawn by habit rather than reason. The mail pouch from London arrived before sunrise and sat in the tack room until a footman collected it for the house. She told herself she only wished to see whether any letter bore a Yorkshire postmark she recognized, some thread connecting her to the world she had lost. She told herself many things, most mornings, to justify the risk. This morning, a faint orange glow flickered through the gap beneath the tackroom door. Genevieve stopped in the shadow of the stalls, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. A fire, at this hour, in a room stacked with dry leather and oiled harness, made no sense unless someone wished it lit for a purpose that had nothing to do with warmth. She crept closer, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall beside the door, and peered through the narrow gap where the hinges did not quite meet the frame. "Mr." Higgins knelt before a small iron brazier, a stack of parchment in his lap. He fed the sheets into the flame one by one, unhurried, the firelight catching the grey in his hair and the hard set of his jaw. Beside him lay an open satchel, the very mail pouch Genevieve had come to watch for, its leather flap thrown back, half its contents already gone to ash. She watched a folded letter catch flame, its wax seal melting and running down the parchment like a wound bleeding red. Diplomatic wax. She knew that particular shade of crimson anywhere. It was the seal used only by couriers of the Foreign Office, the very seals that had once carried her own words across half of Europe. Higgins reached for another letter, and as he unfolded it briefly before feeding it to the flame, something in the slant of the handwriting struck Genevieve like a slap. She knew that hand. She had spent years training it into careful, elegant loops under her governess's watchful eye. It was her own. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed a fist to her lips to keep any sound from escaping. It was not one letter. As Higgins worked through the stack, Genevieve counted 5, 6, 7 sheets, all bearing some fragment of her own writing along the charred edges before they curled to ash. Letters she had sent, over the past 3 years, in secret and at great risk, addressed to Lord Montgomery Vance, Duke of Blackwood. Letters begging him to remember her, to help clear her name, to simply know that she was alive and that everything Sterling had said of her was a lie built to steal her inheritance. Every one of them had ended up here, burned in a stable tack room by the very man who ran this household, before they had ever reached the Duke's desk. Genevieve's isolation, she understood now with a cold and sudden clarity, had not been an accident of circumstance or the natural cruelty of the world. It had been built, brick by careful brick, by someone within these very walls. Someone who had known exactly who she was the moment she arrived at Blackwood, seeking the lowest, most invisible position she could find, and had made certain that whatever whisper of hope she tried to send toward the Duke would never survive the journey to his hands. A horse shifted in its stall behind her, hooves scraping against straw, and the sound was enough to send Genevieve's pulse hammering. She backed away from the door, careful of every footstep, and did not stop moving until she had reached the far end of the stable block, hidden behind a stack of feed sacks, her whole body shaking. Why would Higgins do this? He was only a butler, a man of modest means and modest station, with no obvious quarrel against a scullery maid, nor any evident loyalty to Lord Sterling that she had ever noticed. And yet someone had clearly paid him, or threatened him, or promised him something worth the risk of intercepting a duke's private correspondence for years on end. She thought of Sterling's face the last time she had seen it, her uncle, standing before the Crown's tribunal with tears he did not feel, denouncing his own niece as a traitor with a steadiness that still haunted her dreams. He had always had a talent for finding weak men and making them useful. Genevieve pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the stable and forced her breathing to slow, forced the panic in her chest into something colder and more useful. She could not confront Higgins, not yet, not with no proof beyond what her own eyes had seen through a gap in a door, easily denied. But she could watch him now. She could learn what else he was hiding, and for whom. For the first time since she had come to Blackwood in disgrace and silence, Genevieve felt something other than grief stirring beneath her ribs. It felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of a plan. Sleep had become a stranger to Monty as well, though for reasons less certain than Genevieve's. Some nights it was the old wound at his temple, aching when the weather turned. Other nights it was simply the fog itself, pressing at the edges of his mind, refusing to lift no matter how hard he strained against it. Tonight it was neither. Tonight it was her face, tear-bright in the drawing room, and the sound of his own voice defending a woman he could not fully remember. He gave up on his bed near midnight and wandered the manor with a single candle, the way he had when the great house felt too large and too empty for one restless person. His feet carried him, without much intention, toward the conservatory at the eastern end of the house, his mother's old glass room, still kept warm through the coldest months for the sake of her orchids, tended now more from habit than any real love of flowers. He did not expect to find anyone there. A single lamp burned low on the wrought-iron table near the far wall, its light catching on rows of pale, waxy blooms and casting long shadows across the flagstone floor. Genevieve sat beneath it, still in her grey work dress, though the household had long since retired, a quill in her hand and a scattering of discarded ledger paper before her, covered edge to edge in careful, deliberate marks. Monty stopped in the doorway, unwilling to disturb whatever this was. She had not heard him. Her whole attention was bent over the paper, her brow furrowed in concentration, the quill moving in small, precise strokes that formed no letters he recognized, symbols, rather, arranged in tight clusters, the kind of thing a diplomat might use to guard a message from prying eyes. A cipher. He had seen enough of them in his years abroad to know one when it crossed his path, and this was no clumsy invention. It had structure, rhythm, the sort of internal logic that came only from long practice. A scullery maid did not learn to write in code. A scullery maid, in most houses, did not write at all. "You keep surprising me," he said quietly, stepping into the light. Genevieve startled so violently that her quill skidded across the page, spattering ink in a thin, dark line. She was on her feet in an instant, gathering the papers against her chest, her eyes wide with something closer to fear than embarrassment. "Forgive me," Monty said at once, raising a hand, palm out, the way he might calm a frightened horse. "I did not mean to startle you. Please, sit. I only came for the quiet." She did not sit. She stood frozen by the table, watching him with the wary stillness of someone who had learned, through hard experience, that trust was rarely repaid kindly. Monty lowered himself onto the bench opposite hers instead, giving her the choice of whether to stay or go, and set his candle down beside her lamp. "I will not ask you to explain yourself," he said. "I have no right to demand your secrets. But I confess I have thought of little else these past days but the wirework on my ring, and the way you flinched when Lady Ashworth's name was spoken in my drawing room." Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, that he had noticed at all, or perhaps something closer to relief that someone finally had. After a long moment, she sat. She did not speak. Monty had begun to understand, in the days since the drawing room, that her silence was not a simple absence of voice, the way it might be for someone born without the capacity for speech. It was deliberate. Chosen. A wall built, brick by brick, around whatever truth she was protecting. He nodded toward the ledger paper still clutched against her chest. "May I?" She hesitated a long while before loosening her grip, letting him take one sheet from the pile. He studied the marks in the lamplight. Not gibberish, not the scratchings of an idle mind, but a genuine cipher, built on a substitution key he half recognized from his years at the Foreign Office. He could almost read it, the way one almost remembers a dream upon waking. "This is diplomatic shorthand," he said slowly, "the kind taught to envoys and their aides. Where did you learn it?" Genevieve reached for a fresh sheet of paper, and after a moment's hesitation, wrote 3 words in plain English and turned it toward him. "I cannot say." Cannot or dare not? She considered this, then wrote again. Both. Monty studied her face in the lamplight, the fine bones beneath the soot-smudged skin, the intelligence in her eyes that no amount of grey wool or linen cap could disguise. He thought of his own scattered memory, of the flash he'd seen when she mended his ring, a room hung with silk and candlelight, her hands quick and clever at a long table crowded with ministers. "I think," he said carefully, "that I know you, or knew you, before Vienna took the memory from me. I think whatever happened to bring you to my scullery was no accident of poverty, and I think you are far more frightened of being recognized than you are of scrubbing my floors for the rest of your days." Genevieve's hand trembled on the quill. For a long moment she simply looked at him, and Monty saw, beneath the fear, something achingly familiar. A grief carried so long it had become part of her, the way a stone in a riverbed is shaped by water it can no longer remember. She did not deny what he had said. She did not confirm it either. Instead, she reached across the small table and, with a gentleness that startled him more than any words could have, laid her hand briefly over his. It was the barest touch, gone almost as soon as it began, but it carried more honesty than anything spoken aloud in that drawing room days before. Monty did not pull away. He sat very still, watching the candlelight flicker across her face, and understood, with a certainty that needed no memory to support it, that whatever had grown between them once was not lost after all. It had only been waiting, patient as the orchids around them, for the right hour to bloom again. The carriage arrived unannounced on a grey Tuesday morning, its wheels churning mud along the drive as though its owner cared little for the state of the roads or the inconvenience of an unexpected call. Monty heard it from his study window and felt an odd tightening in his chest before he even saw the crest painted on the door, a serpent coiled around a sheaf of wheat, the mark of the Stirling family. He did not know why the sight unsettled him so. He had met Lord Malachi Stirling perhaps twice in his life, at gatherings too dull to leave much impression, and had no particular reason to distrust the man beyond a vague sense, half-formed and impossible to explain, that something about him did not sit well. Higgins met the visitor at the door with his usual smooth efficiency, and within minutes Lord Stirling was shown into the drawing-room, shaking rain from his greatcoat and complaining, in a voice pitched to carry, about the state of the northern roads. "Blackwood," he said warmly, extending a hand as Monty entered. "You look well, all things considered. I heard the most dreadful reports out of Vienna." "Lord Stirling." Monty shook the offered hand, though something in the man's grip, too firm, too eager, made him wish to withdraw it at once. "This is unexpected." "Forgive the intrusion. I was travelling north on business and thought I might impose on an old acquaintance for a night's lodging, and perhaps a small favour, if you'll indulge me." Stirling smiled, showing too many teeth. "A matter of some capital. My tenants have had a difficult season, and I find myself temporarily embarrassed. A loan, nothing more, against my own lands as security. I would not ask if I did not trust you above most men in England." Monty gestured him toward a chair with the practiced courtesy of a man raised to it, though privately he found himself reluctant to agree to anything so quickly. "We can discuss the particulars over dinner," he said. "For now, please, sit. I'll have tea brought in." He rang for the maids. Genevieve arrived with the tray perhaps 10 minutes later, and the moment she stepped through the door, Monty saw the change in her at once. The way her shoulders drew tight, the way her chin dropped lower than it had for any other guest, the way her hands, usually so steady even under his own scrutiny, trembled faintly as she set the tea things upon the low table. Stirling did not look at her. Servants rarely earned a second glance from men of his sort, and for that Monty found himself unexpectedly grateful, though he could not yet say why. "You were speaking of Vienna," Stirling said, turning back to Monty as Genevieve poured. "Terrible business. I understand you lost a good deal of memory in the attack. A pity. You are always sharper than the rest of us at recalling names and faces. I imagine half the court could slip past you now without your knowing them at all." There was something in the way he said it, too careless to be careless, the sort of remark a man made when he wished to test the ground beneath his feet before stepping fully onto it. Monty studied him a moment longer than politeness required. "My memory returns in pieces," Monty said evenly. "More each week, in fact. I find I remember far more than people expect." Something flickered across Stirling's face, gone as quickly as it came, but Monty had spent a decade reading the small tells of men across negotiating tables, and he did not miss it. Unease. Quickly buried, but unease all the same. Genevieve set the last cup before Stirling and stepped back toward the sideboard, keeping her body angled so that her face remained mostly turned from him, her cap pulled as low as decorum allowed without drawing comment. Monty noticed the careful geometry of it. She had positioned herself, whether by instinct or long practice, so that Stirling would need to turn his head fully around to see her clearly, and no guest bothered to study the servants pouring his tea. "You keep a fine household," Stirling remarked, glancing idly around the room. "Though I confess I'm surprised to find you so thin on staff for a manor this size. Surely the Duke of Blackwood can afford a proper complement of maids." "We manage," Monty said. "I find I prefer a smaller household since my return, fewer strangers underfoot." It was, he realized even as he said it, not entirely untrue. Stirling's gaze drifted, almost lazily, toward the sideboard, and for one heart-stopping moment, Monty saw his eyes pause on Genevieve's bowed head, not with recognition, not yet, but with the idle curiosity of a man cataloguing a room out of habit. Monty felt something in his chest go cold and sharp all at once, a protective instinct he could not fully name rising up before he had even decided to act on it. "That will be all, thank you," he said to Genevieve, his tone sharper than he intended, and rose from his chair to move toward the window, positioning himself quite deliberately, though he told himself it was mere restlessness, between Sterling's line of sight and the sideboard where she stood. Genevieve slipped from the room a moment later, quiet as ever, and Monty did not relax until the door had closed fully behind her. "You seem tense, Blackwood," Sterling observed, watching him with those pale, calculating eyes. "Vienna left its mark on more than your memory, it seems." "Perhaps," Monty said, returning to his seat, though his mind was no longer on the conversation at all. He thought instead of Genevieve's trembling hands, of the way she had shrunk from a man she had not even looked at directly, the way a creature shrinks from a predator it has learned, through hard experience, never to trust. He did not yet know why Lord Sterling's presence in his house should frighten a scullery maid so deeply, but he intended, before Sterling left Blackwood, to find out. Sterling stayed 3 nights instead of 1, extending his visit each morning with fresh excuses about the state of the roads, and each of those nights Monty found sleep harder to come by than before. He watched his guest across the dinner table, watched the easy way Sterling charmed the housekeeper and flattered the cook, watched, too, the small courtesies that passed between Sterling and Higgins, nothing overt, nothing a stranger might notice, but a familiarity that struck Monty as odd for a butler and a visiting lord who claimed, when asked directly, to have met only once before. It was the 4th morning, with Sterling finally gone and the house settling back into its usual rhythm, that Monty acted on the suspicion that had been building in him for days. He had learned, in his years abroad, that the surest way to understand a man's true business was to look at where he kept his money and where he kept his secrets, and that both, more often than not, occupied the same drawer. Higgins had served the Blackwood household for 11 years, a man of modest wages and modest tastes by all appearances. And yet Monty had noticed, over recent weeks, small things that did not fit that picture. A new watch chain, finer boots than a butler's salary ought to allow, a certain confidence in his bearing that had not been there before Vienna. Monty waited until the household staff had gathered below stairs for their midday meal, a rare hour when the attic rooms above the kitchens stood empty, and climbed the narrow servants' stair alone. Higgins's quarters were modest but tidy, as befitted a man of his station, a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk beneath the single window. Monty felt a flicker of shame at what he was about to do, searching the private room of a man who had served his family faithfully for over a decade, but the shame did not stop him. Something in his gut, some instinct sharpened by years of reading liars across negotiating tables, told him he would find what he was looking for here. It took him longer than he expected. He searched the desk drawers first, finding nothing but ordinary household accounts and a handful of personal letters from a sister in Leeds. He checked beneath the mattress, behind the washstand, along the floorboards near the hearth. It was only when he noticed the wardrobe standing slightly askew from the wall, its back panel not quite flush, that he found the loose board behind it, and beneath that, a small mahogany chest secured with a brass padlock. The lock gave way easily enough to the letter opener Monty had carried up from his study for precisely this purpose. He lifted the lid and went very still. Inside lay a stack of unopened letters, perhaps a dozen, tied together with faded ribbon, every one addressed in the same careful hand to Lord Montgomery Vance, Duke of Blackwood, and every one bearing a broken diplomatic seal. Broken, Monty realized with a cold jolt, not by any recipient, but by someone who had opened them, read them, and resealed them imperfectly before hiding them away. He untied the ribbon with unsteady hands and opened the first letter. "My lord," it began, "I do not know if these words will reach you, but I must try. You will have heard by now the lies my uncle has spun against me before the crown. I swear to you upon everything I once held dear that I never betrayed the crown's confidence, not in Vienna nor anywhere else. I write to you because you, above all men, know the truth of what passed between us at the summit, and because I have nowhere else left to turn." The hand was Genevieve's. He knew it now with absolute certainty, having watched her write those small cipher marks in the conservatory only days before. He read on, letter after letter, each one more desperate than the last, chronicling 3 years of silence met with silence, of hope worn thin and then thinner still, of a woman watching every door close around her one by one, while the one man who might have saved her never answered, because he never knew she had written at all. Beneath the letters lay a second stack of papers, not correspondence this time, but ledgers, columns of figures in a different hand entirely, recording payments made on dates stretching back nearly 3 years. Monty recognized the signature at the bottom of each page before he had finished reading the first line. M. Sterling. The truth assembled itself in his mind with the terrible clarity of a puzzle finally solved, each piece sliding into place at once. Higgins had been paid, handsomely and regularly, to intercept any correspondence bearing Genevieve's hand before it reached the Duke's desk. Sterling had known, somehow, that she had fled to Blackwood, perhaps had known from the very beginning, had perhaps even arranged it, steering her toward the one household where his own man already stood watch at the door. Every letter she had risked her safety to write, every desperate attempt to reach him, had ended here, in a locked chest in a butler's attic room, read and hidden and forgotten by everyone except the man who buried them. Monty sat back on his heels amid the scattered papers, the weight of it settling over him like a physical thing. He thought of Genevieve, standing at his sideboard with her head bowed, 3 years spent scrubbing his floors and mending his silver, while her own letters sat unread in the very roof above her. 3 years of silence that had never needed to happen at all, if only one dishonest servant had not stood between them. The scullery maid in his kitchen was Lady Genevieve Ashworth. She had been living beneath his own roof, invisible in her grey wool and linen cap, for longer than he cared to guess, and he had not known her, not truly, not with the whole of his memory intact, until a broken signet ring and a length of silver wire had cracked something open in him that no physician's remedy ever could. He gathered the letters and the ledgers carefully into his coat, replaced the lock as best he could to buy himself time, and made his way back down the narrow stair with his heart pounding harder than it had since the alley in Vienna. He knew now exactly who she was. What remained was deciding what he meant to do about it. He found her near the boundary stream the following evening, exactly where the head gardener had once told him the scullery staff sometimes walked to gather watercress before dusk. She stood among the old oaks with a basket half forgotten at her feet, watching the water slide over smooth grey stones, her shawl pulled tight against the cooling air. Monty had spent the whole of the previous night and the better part of the day deciding how he would approach this moment, rehearsing words that felt too formal, too cold, too much like a duke addressing a stranger rather than a man addressing the woman whose letters had broken something loose in his chest. In the end, he abandoned every rehearsed line and simply walked toward her, the mended signet ring in one hand and the ribbon-tied bundle of letters in the other. She heard his footsteps and turned, and whatever she saw in his face told her at once that everything had changed. "Genevieve," he said, and watched her flinch at the sound of her own true name spoken aloud, out here, with no drawing-room walls to muffle it. Or should I say, Lady Genevieve Ashworth. She went very still, the basket forgotten entirely now, her eyes moving from his face to the letters in his hand, and back again. For a moment, Monty thought she might run, the way a hunted animal runs when the shadow of the hunter finally falls across its path, and he raised his free hand quickly, palm out, the same gesture he had used in the conservatory. "I am not here to expose you," he said. "I found these in Higgins's quarters. Every letter you wrote me over these 3 years, opened and hidden and never delivered. I have read them all, Genevieve, every word." Her composure broke at last, the tears she had held back for so long finally spilling over, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth as though she might still stop herself from making a sound, even now, even after everything. "I remember," Monty said quietly, closing the distance between them. "Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Vienna, the summit, you arguing with 3 ministers twice your age and winning, because you were always the sharpest mind in any room you entered. I remember standing beside you on a balcony overlooking the river, and I remember thinking that I had never in my life met anyone I trusted so completely." He held out the signet ring, its silver-mended crack catching the last of the evening light. I remember loving you. I think some part of me never stopped, even when the rest of me forgot your face entirely. Genevieve took the ring from his open palm, her fingers closing around it as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had spent 3 years trying to convince her she did not exist. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her at Blackwood, she did not lower her eyes. She reached instead into the pocket of her apron and drew out the small slate board she had taken to carrying since the conservatory, along with a stub of chalk, and began to write with quick, urgent strokes. Sterling arranged Vienna. The ambush was his. Monty read the words twice, a cold understanding settling over him even before she finished writing. He could not let you testify for me before the tribunal. You were the only man of standing who knew the truth of what happened at the summit, that I uncovered his smuggling arrangement with French agents, not the other way around. He twisted it, made it appear I was the traitor, and paid men in Vienna to see that you never returned to speak in my defense. Monty stared at the slate, the pieces of 3 years assembling themselves into a shape far darker than he had imagined, even after finding the letters in Higgins's chest. He had always assumed the ambush a matter of chance, the ordinary danger of a diplomat's life abroad. It had never once occurred to him that it might have been arranged, deliberately, to silence him before he could speak the one truth that would have saved her. He tried to have me gone, Monty said slowly, to keep me from clearing your name. Genevieve nodded, wiping the slate clean with the edge of her sleeve before writing again. When you did not return, and no word came, I believed you were gone. I fled before Sterling's men could find me. I came here because it was the last place anyone would think to look for a disgraced traitor in the household of the very man I had once loved, scrubbing his floors under his own roof, because I trusted no one else and had nowhere else left to go. The confession hung between them in the fading light, and Monty felt something in his chest crack open at last. 3 years of buried grief and stubborn hope finally finding each other across the small distance of the stream bank. He reached out and took her free hand in both of his, careful, as though she might still vanish if he moved too quickly. You have spent 3 years alone, punished for a crime that was never yours, while I forgot even your face, he said. That ends now. I do not care what it costs me, my title, my standing, every friendship I have left in this county. I mean to see Sterling exposed and your name restored, whatever the price. Genevieve's eyes searched his face for a long moment, as though she still could not quite believe what she was hearing after so long expecting only disappointment. Then, slowly, she nodded and pressed the mended signet ring back into his palm, closing his fingers around it with both of her own hands, as if sealing a promise neither of them yet dared to speak aloud. Behind them, unnoticed by either, a figure withdrew quietly from the tree line near the stable path. Higgins, who had followed the Duke at a careful distance and heard rather more of the conversation than either Monty or Genevieve would have wished. He turned back toward the house at once, already composing in his mind the letter he intended to send to Lord Sterling before nightfall. They left Blackwood 3 days later, before the household had fully stirred, in a plain travelling coach without the ducal crest painted on its door. Monty had insisted on this precaution himself, unwilling to trust anyone at the manor with knowledge of their departure until he understood how deep Higgins's loyalties to Sterling truly ran. He had not confronted the butler outright, not yet. A confrontation would only warn Sterling that his scheme was unravelling before Monty had gathered enough proof to see it undone for good. Better, he had decided, to let Higgins believe himself unsuspected a little while longer. Genevieve sat across from him in the coach, dressed for the first time in years in something other than grey wool and a linen cap. Monty had sent to York for a modest travelling gown of deep blue wool, trimmed in velvet, plain enough not to draw notice on the road, fine enough that she no longer looked, at first glance, like a servant fleeing her post. She had stared at the gown for a long moment when it arrived, running her fingers over the velvet trim as though she had forgotten such things existed outside of memory. "You need not have troubled yourself," she said, her first spoken words to him since the stream, offered hesitantly, her voice rough with disuse, but unmistakably her own. Monty had felt something unlock in his chest the first time he heard it, 3 days prior, when she had finally found the courage to test her voice aloud in the privacy of the conservatory. She still preferred her slate for anything requiring more than a few words, the habit of silence not easily undone after 3 years of practice. But she was speaking now, in fragments, and each fragment felt to Monty like a small miracle. "I disagree entirely," he said. "You are travelling to London to reclaim a dukedom's worth of standing before the High Magistrate. You will not do it dressed as a scullery maid." The roads north of London were rough with autumn rain, and the journey stretched across 2 full days, broken only by a night's rest at a coaching inn near Grantham, where Monty had booked separate rooms under false names, a precaution that felt almost absurd given how thoroughly he wished, in that quiet, unguarded hour after supper, simply to sit beside her without pretense of any kind. It was on the second day, somewhere past Peterborough, with the fenland stretching flat and grey beyond the coach window, that Genevieve finally set down her slate entirely and spoke at length for the first time since Vienna had taken everything from her. "I used to imagine this," she said quietly, watching the passing fields rather than his face, as though the confession came easier without his eyes upon her. "Not the flight to London. I never dared imagine anything so hopeful as that. Only this. Sitting across from you, in a coach, going somewhere together. I imagined it so many times in that first year that I nearly convinced myself it had already happened, some earlier version of it, before the ambush and the tribunal and all of it. A memory I'd invented because the truth was too unbearable to sit with alone." Monty reached across the small space between the seats and took her hand, the way he had taken to doing whenever the silence between them grew heavy with things not yet fully said. "I am sorry it took me so long to become worth imagining." "You did not forget me by choice," Genevieve said. "I have had 3 years to be angry at many things, Monty. I never once managed to be angry at you." He studied her face in the pale afternoon light, struck again by how little resemblance she now bore to the bowed, silent maid who had knelt by his hearth mending a broken ring. Something in her had begun to unfurl since leaving Blackwood, some long-suppressed version of herself finding air at last, and Monty found himself falling for her anew each hour of the journey, as though the woman beside him now and the woman he had loved at the summit were 2 people he had the rare privilege of meeting twice. They spoke, over that second day, of things neither had dared raise before, of her family's estate in Kent, seized and sold off within months of her disgrace, of the small mercies that had kept her alive during her first desperate weeks as a fugitive, of Monty's own father and the expectations of the dukedom that had always sat uneasily on his shoulders even before Vienna complicated everything further. "They will not simply accept my word against Sterling's," Monty said, as the coach rattled on toward the capital, the conversation turning at last to the trial ahead. "He has spent 3 years building his story before the Crown. We will need more than my testimony and your letters." "We have the ledgers," Genevieve reminded him, "in Sterling's own hand, recording payments to Higgins." "Which prove Higgins was paid. Not that Sterling ordered the ambush, nor that the charges against you were fabricated." Monty frowned out at the darkening sky. "We need something that ties him directly to Vienna, something no clever lawyer can argue away." Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, turning the mended signet ring, his ring, which she had insisted he wear again the morning they departed, over in her fingers where it caught the last grey light through the window. "There is one man who might know," she said finally, "the Austrian courier who carried messages between the ministers at the summit. If Sterling arranged the ambush from within Vienna, that courier would have seen the coin change hands, or at least heard the whispers among the household staff there. I never dared write to him. It would have endangered us both, but if we could reach him before the magistrate convenes—" "Then we do not simply travel to London to plead our case," Monty finished, something sharpening in his voice that had not been there since before the ambush. "We travel to build one Sterling cannot survive." The coach rolled on through the gathering dusk, London's distant glow beginning to smudge the horizon ahead of them, and for the first time in 3 years, Genevieve allowed herself to believe that the darkness pressing in around her might, at long last, be nearing its end. London greeted them with fog thick enough to swallow the tops of the buildings whole, and a message already waiting at their lodgings that told Monty, before he had even removed his travelling coat, that Sterling knew of their arrival. The note bore no signature, only a single line in a hand Genevieve recognized at once from years of watching her uncle draft correspondence at the family estate. "You will regret returning to a city that has already judged you." "He knows," Genevieve said, staring at the paper with a steadiness Monty found remarkable, given how badly her hands had trembled the last time Sterling's name was spoken aloud in a drawing room. 3 years of hiding had left her wary, but the woman beside him now did not flinch from a threat the way the scullery maid once had. "Higgins," Monty said grimly. "He must have sent word the same night he followed us to the stream." There was little time to dwell on it. The High Magistrate's Court had been petitioned already, through channels Monty's solicitor had quietly arranged before they ever left Yorkshire, and the hearing was set for 2 days hence, a date Sterling, it seemed, intended to meet with a defence of his own. Monty spent that first frantic day chasing down the Austrian courier Genevieve had spoken of on the road, a man named Joseph Brandt, who, fortune willing, had taken a position with a shipping merchant near the London docks after leaving Vienna the previous year. It took the better part of the day and a considerable bribe to a dockside clerk before Monty found him, and longer still to convince a frightened foreign servant that testifying against an English lord would not see him hanged for his trouble. Brandt agreed in the end, though his hands shook as he signed the sworn statement Monty's solicitor drew up that evening, a statement describing, in careful detail, an Englishman who had paid 2 Vienna ruffians to arrange an ambush along the diplomatic quarter, timed precisely to the evening Lord Blackwood was due to leave for London to testify before the tribunal that would decide Genevieve Ashworth's fate. The morning of the hearing arrived grey and close, the Guildhall's great chamber packed tighter than Monty had expected for a matter he had assumed would draw only minor interest among the peers. He understood why the moment he saw Sterling seated near the front, resplendent in dark green velvet, flanked by 2 barristers and wearing the composed, faintly amused expression of a man who believed himself entirely safe. Genevieve sat beside Monty in a gown of deep grey silk, her own choice, she had told him that morning, a quiet echo of the maid's wool she had worn for 3 years, worn now not in hiding, but in defiance. The proceedings opened with Sterling's counsel painting the same picture the Crown had accepted 3 years prior, a niece who had betrayed diplomatic confidences to French agents, who had fled England rather than face justice, whose sudden reappearance now, on the arm of a duke known to have suffered a severe blow to the head, ought to be regarded with the deepest suspicion rather than sympathy. "Indeed," Sterling's barrister continued, his voice ringing through the packed chamber, "one might wonder whether His Grace's testimony can be trusted at all, given his own admission of memory loss. It would not be the first time a sympathetic tale was spun for a man whose recollection cannot be relied upon." Monty felt Genevieve's hand tighten briefly on his sleeve, but he did not need her steadying touch to keep his composure. He rose when his turn came, laid the ribbon-tied letters before the magistrate, then the ledgers bearing Sterling's own signature, recording years of payments to a servant in the Blackwood household, and finally Brandt's sworn statement, read aloud by the clerk to a chamber that had gone very still. Sterling's composed expression did not waver until the clerk reached the courier's description of the 2 Vienna men paid to arrange the ambush, a description that matched, in uncomfortable detail, 2 ruffians who had once served briefly on Sterling's own household staff before vanishing from England entirely the following year. It was then, with the chamber murmuring and Sterling's barristers conferring in low, urgent tones, that the doors at the rear of the hall opened and an unexpected figure stepped through them. Higgins. Monty had not summoned him. He had not even known the butler had followed them to London at all, and for one sharp moment he feared the man had come only to defend Sterling further, to muddy whatever ground they had gained. But Higgins walked the length of the aisle with the stiff, hollowed-out bearing of a man who had finally run out of places to hide, and when the magistrate called for order and asked his business, Higgins spoke words Monty had not expected to hear from him in 100 years. "I have come to confess," he said, his voice unsteady but clear enough to carry through the whole of the chamber. Lord Stirling paid me to intercept Lady Ashworth's letters to the Duke of Blackwood and threatened my sister's position in Leeds if I refused. I did as I was told for 3 years, out of cowardice, and I have lived with it every day since. I will not carry it further." He turned briefly toward Genevieve, something like shame etched deep into his weathered face. "I am sorry, my lady. Sorrier than I can say." The uproar that followed swallowed whatever composure remained in Stirling's expression entirely. He rose from his seat, shouting something about conspiracy and forged testimony, his barristers scrambling uselessly to regain control of a case that had unravelled in the space of a single morning, while the peers of the realm looked on with the particular hunger reserved for scandal too rich to look away from. Monty reached for Genevieve's hand beneath the table and found it steady now, no longer trembling, her chin lifted in the same proud, unbowed manner he remembered from a candlelit hall in Vienna, years before everything had gone so terribly wrong. Whatever came next, he understood, watching Stirling's carefully built lie collapse in real time before the whole of London society. The truth had finally, after 3 long years, found its way into the light. The Crown's decree arrived 9 days after the hearing, sealed in red wax and delivered by a royal courier who bowed rather lower than Genevieve had grown accustomed to receiving from anyone in 3 years. She read it twice through before she allowed herself to believe the words on the page were real. Her title restored in full, her family's lands in Kent returned to her name. Every charge against her struck from the record as though the tribunal that condemned her had never sat at all. Lord Stirling had been taken into custody the same afternoon of the hearing, his barristers abandoning his defence entirely once Higgins's confession and Brandt's testimony left no thread of the old story worth salvaging. He awaited trial now, in circumstances considerably less comfortable than the ones he had arranged for his niece, and Higgins, for his part, had been shown a measure of leniency by the magistrate in exchange for the fullness of his confession. A debt of gratitude Genevieve found she could extend, however reluctantly, to a man who had at least found the courage to undo some small part of what he had helped destroy. "You are remarkably calm for a woman who has just had her entire life returned to her," Monty said, watching her fold the decree carefully back into its wax seal, as though she feared it might vanish if handled too roughly. "I do not think it has fully reached me yet," Genevieve admitted. 3 years is a long time to believe oneself forgotten. I'm not certain my heart yet knows how to hold good news." He had suggested the walk that afternoon, once the London solicitors had finished with their papers and there was nothing left to sign or argue or defend. A quiet turn through St. James's Park, away from the crowds that had gathered outside the Guildhall these past days, hungry for a glimpse of the disgraced lady so dramatically restored. The gardens wore the last gold of autumn, the plane trees shedding their leaves in slow drifts across the gravel paths, and Genevieve walked beside him in a gown of pale silk that had been delivered that very morning from a Bond Street modiste, the first entirely new gown she had owned in 3 years that was not chosen for the purpose of hiding. They walked a long while without speaking, the comfortable kind of silence that had grown between them over the past weeks, before Monty stopped beneath the bare branches of an old plane tree and turned to face her fully. "I have been trying to find the right words for several days now," he said, "and I confess every version I have practiced sounds foolish the moment I imagine saying it aloud." Genevieve tilted her head, something warm and curious lighting her expression. "Try one anyway. When I found you mending my ring, I did not know your name. I knew only that something in me recognized you before the rest of my memory caught up to the truth. I have spent every day since trying to understand how a man could forget the woman he loved and still, somehow, know her the instant she stood before him again." He reached into his coat and drew out the signet ring, mended now for a second time, the silver wire that had once repaired a crack in the gold, reset and polished until it gleamed like a deliberate ornament rather than a scar. "I do not wish to spend whatever years remain to me forgetting you again, Genevieve. I want to marry you. Not as a duke rescuing a disgraced lady, and not out of guilt for what my own household allowed to happen to you, but because I have loved you since a candlelit hall in Vienna, and I never truly stopped, even when I could not remember your face." The wind stirred the last leaves from the plane tree above them, scattering gold across the gravel path. And for a long moment Genevieve said nothing at all, her eyes bright with the same held-back tears Monty had first noticed in his drawing room weeks ago, when a stranger's gossip had nearly broken her silence for good. She had spent 3 years believing her voice too dangerous to use, 3 years training herself to answer the world with slate and chalk and careful, guarded stillness. She had spoken only in fragments since leaving Blackwood, testing each word as though it might cost her something she could not afford to lose. Now, standing beneath the bare branches, with her title restored and her name cleared before the whole of London, Genevieve found there was nothing left holding the words behind her teeth. "Yes," she said, clearly, steadily, the single syllable carrying further than she intended in the quiet of the gardens. "Yes, Monty, I will marry you." It was the first time in over a year that anyone had heard her speak more than a passing sentence, and the sound of her own voice, whole and unbroken and entirely her own, startled her nearly as much as it delighted him. She laughed, an unfamiliar sound even to herself, rusty with disuse but genuine all the same, and Monty pulled her into his arms right there on the gravel path, heedless of the few strollers who turned to stare at a duke embracing a lady in full view of St. James's Park. "Say it again," he murmured against her hair. "Yes," she said, laughing properly now, the tears finally spilling over, though they carried nothing of grief in them any longer. "Yes, 100 times if you like. I have 3 years of silence to make up for." He drew back just far enough to slide the mended signet ring from his own finger and press it instead into her palm, closing her fingers around it the way she had once done for him beside the boundary stream at Blackwood. "Then let us begin," he said, "with this." Above them, the last of the autumn leaves drifted down across the gravel path, and somewhere beyond the garden walls, London carried on entirely unaware that a scandal 3 years in the making had just quietly resolved itself into the beginning of something far gentler than anyone watching the Guildhall trial could have predicted. The chapel at Blackwood had not seen a wedding in nearly 30 years, not since Monty's own parents had stood before its worn stone altar, and the estate carpenters had spent the better part of a fortnight restoring the old oak pews and polishing the brass fittings until the small, ancient building shone as though it had been waiting all this time for precisely this occasion. Genevieve stood in the small vestry off the side of the chapel, dressed in ivory silk trimmed with her family's own lace, recovered, along with a handful of other treasures, from the Kent estate that had been quietly returned to her name over the preceding weeks. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper who had once overseen Genevieve's scullery duties, without ever suspecting the truth beneath the soot and wool, now fussed over the arrangement of her veil, with tears standing openly in her eyes. "I ought to have known," the older woman said, not for the first time that morning, shaking her head at her own blindness. "Something in the way you carried yourself, even scrubbing floors. I ought to have known you for a lady." "You knew me for a hard worker," Genevieve said gently, "and treated me kindly when you had no cause to treat me as anything more. That was worth more to me than you can guess, those first months." Beyond the vestry door, Blackwood Chapel had filled with faces both familiar and new. The household staff seated near the back in their Sunday best, Higgins conspicuously absent by his own quiet request, having taken a modest position in a distant parish rather than remain anywhere near the household he had betrayed. Lord Stirling's trial had concluded a fortnight prior, ending in a sentence of transportation that would see him spend whatever years remained to him far from England's shores. His lands and titles stripped and reassigned by royal decree, his name struck from every registry of the peerage he had once schemed so viciously to preserve. Genevieve had thought she might feel something like triumph at the news of his conviction. Instead, she had felt only a quiet settling, the last knot of old fear finally loosening in her chest, leaving room at last for something gentler to grow in its place. The chapel doors opened, and Genevieve walked the short aisle on the arm of Dr. Fenwick, the family physician having become, over these strange months, something like the father she had lost years before to illness. She kept her eyes on Monty as she walked, watching the wonder in his face grow with every step, and found she no longer needed her slate to say what she felt. The words came easily now, the way they had begun to come easily these past weeks, each one a small victory over 3 years of enforced silence. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur. The vicar's familiar words, the exchange of vows spoken clearly and without hesitation on both sides, the mended signet ring slipped once more onto Monty's finger, this time to stay. When at last the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the small chapel erupted into applause, far more enthusiastic than decorum strictly allowed, the household staff on their feet, several of the older maids weeping openly into their handkerchiefs at the sight of the shy, silent scullery girl they had known transformed, before their very eyes, into the Duchess of Blackwood. The wedding breakfast that followed spread across the manor's great hall, tables laden with far more food than the household had prepared in years, and Genevieve found herself, for the first time in longer than she could comfortably remember, surrounded entirely by people who wished her nothing but good. She moved among the guests on Monty's arm, accepting congratulations from neighbours who had once gossiped so carelessly about her disgrace in this very manor's drawing room, and found she carried no bitterness toward them at all. They had believed a lie carefully built to be believed. She understood, now, better than most, how easily the truth could be buried when the right people wished it hidden. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, Monty drew her away from the crowded hall and out onto the stone balcony overlooking the estate's eastern fields, the same fields he had ridden across so many restless mornings while his memory slowly pieced itself back together. The autumn air had turned crisp, the last of the season's colour glowing across the distant tree line, and below them the manor grounds stretched out quiet and golden in the fading light.
"Do you remember," Monty said, "the first time I asked who taught you that wirework on my ring?"
"I remember thinking I had made a terrible mistake letting you see it," Genevieve said. "I very nearly did not." "I'm glad you did." He took her hand, the mended ring catching the last of the sun. "I spent 3 years as a duke with a fine house and a fine name and no notion at all of what I was missing, until a scullery maid mended a broken ring and something in me finally woke up." Genevieve leaned against him, watching the light fade slowly over the fields that were now, in some part, her own as much as his. "I spent 3 years believing I had lost everything worth keeping," she said. "My name, my home, my voice. I never once imagined I would find all of it again in the last place anyone thought to look, hiding in plain sight in the house of the very man I had never stopped loving." Monty pressed a kiss to her temple, and together they stood a long while on the balcony as the sun sank behind Blackwood's eastern hills. Two people who had lost each other through no fault of their own and found their way back through patience, courage, and the stubborn refusal of the truth to stay buried forever. Below them, the manor windows glowed warm with candlelight, and somewhere within, the household that had once overlooked a silent maid now toasted the health and happiness of their new duchess. A woman who had learned, at long last, that the world had never truly stopped listening. She had simply needed the right person to hear her.